that President Lincoln, when speaking of the purposes of the war and what was to be obtained by victory in the Civil War, spoke of how this was a war which was being fought not only for the present generation, but for all times to come and for all peoples everywhere. And that the imperishable principle of liberty, that jewel, he said, in the crown, that was something that was being fought for people everywhere. So in that respect, those of your ancestors who fought on the battlefields of the war were fighting the battle of my ancestors and for my ancestors as well. And together today, we are united in that same reverence and give that same honor to the cause of liberty for which they fought, and in that sense we are all bound together as one. But I am here tonight to talk about President Lincoln and his Gettysburg Address. So let me begin by giving you 3 news items. Not quite current news, but still news items. Item number 1. On the first anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, a commemoration ceremony at Ground Zero featured New York Governor George Pataki reading the Gettysburg Address. Item number 2. In 1963, Martin Luther King, Jr. told a black journalist that his "I Have a Dream" speech was designed to be a sort of Gettysburg Address. And he opened it with words directly modeled on the Gettysburg Address. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Item number 3. In the 1935 movie Ruggles of Red Gap, an English butler, played by Charles Lawton, set loose on the American frontier, establishes his right to a piece of the American dream by reciting, in front of a saloon full of incredulous cowboys, the Gettysburg Address. Is it too much to ask what exactly is going on here? The short story of the Gettysburg Address is that it was a surprisingly short speech delivered by Abraham Lincoln as part of the dedication ceremonies for the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg on November 19, 1863, 4.5 months after the climactic battle of the American Civil War at Gettysburg. But the long story is that no single American utterance has had the staying power or commanded the respect and the reverence accorded the Gettysburg Address. It has been engraved on the south wall of the Lincoln Memorial. It has been translated in a book devoted to nothing but translations of the Gettysburg Address, and analyzed in at least 9 full-dress critical studies over the last century. It has become the stuff of American myth and legend, including the story invented in the 1880s that Lincoln wrote the address as an afterthought on the back of an envelope while on the train bringing him to Gettysburg. In truth, Lincoln had been working on his remarks for days before leaving Washington for the dedication ceremonies, and had a full finished version in hand when he boarded the train. As a chronically fussy and unsatisfied editor of his own words, he did write a new ending once he arrived in Gettysburg, but there is nothing which suggests he wrote any part of the address en route. But looked at from a distance, even the myths are backhanded tributes to the Gettysburg Address. After all, only a document of near divine inspiration could have been written on a train. So what was it about these words, which Lincoln was invited to speak on November 19, 1863, which has struck so deeply? Partly, the answer lies in its language. The Gettysburg Address obeys the Churchillian dictum. Short words are best, and the old words, when short, are best of all. In this address of just 272 words, 190 of them are single syllables. Only 4 are 4 syllables. Rarely has so much been compressed into such simple and uncomplicated elements. But I am not sure that the simplicity of Lincoln's vocabulary explains very much on its own, because short words are not necessarily interesting words, or even clear words, and certainly not every word in the address is short. It is not just a simplified vocabulary which makes the Gettysburg Address remarkable, but an overall pattern of conscious simplicity which Lincoln adopted. Public speaking in Lincoln's day was actually a 4-way struggle between several different patterns of speech. There was vernacular, or folk speech, the speech you would use in everyday conversation with other people. Technical speech, the kind of speech you would find in instruction manuals. Middle speech, and classical or academic speech. What Lincoln had always adopted as his style of speech was the pattern of middling speech, the speech of lawyers, of popular preachers, of newspapers. Middling speech was a mark above the slangy bluntness of folk speech, but without an overreaching for the inflated, euphemistic, classical speech of the college literati. In other words, he was looking rhetorically for the same middle ground occupied culturally and politically by his own Republican Party, which aspired to represent the American middle class. Like the middle class entrepreneurs, commercial farmers, and manufacturers whom Lincoln praised and defended as over against the slave-owning plantation class, middling speech could verge on the plainness of slang, as Lincoln sometimes did, to the discomfort of the prissy. But it was also speech that was rational enough to sustain argument. It could have both an inelegant plainness and occasional peaks of refined professionalism. It was middle-class language, directed to the middle class of Americans by a man who was preeminently himself a man of the middle class. Just how consciously middling Lincoln's speech was in the Gettysburg Address can be seen if we contrast it with an early, impulsive version of the Gettysburg Address's famous opening line 77 years ago. On July 7th, 1863, speaking to an exultant crowd which had gathered at the White House to cheer Lincoln for the newly announced victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Lincoln offered what should be considered as the first draft of the Gettysburg Address. It was not a planned-for occasion. Lincoln was speaking off the cuff, and it showed. This is what he said. How long ago is it? 80-odd years? Since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation by its representatives assembled and declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. That was the birthday of the United States of America. Now, on this last 4th of July, just passed, when we have a gigantic rebellion, at the bottom of which is an effort to overthrow the principle that all men were created equal, we have the surrender of a most powerful position and army on that very day, and not only so, but in it a succession of battles in Pennsylvania, near to us, through 3 days, so rapidly fought that they might be called one great battle on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of the month of July, and on the 4th, the cohorts of those who opposed the declaration that all men are created equal turn tail and run. We can hear the advance echoes of what will become the Gettysburg Address in these words, but this time they appear in the pattern of vernacular speech, unscripted, unself-conscious, almost conversational. How long ago is it? 80-odd years? And, if you hadn't noticed, It's all strung together in a single, awkwardly run-together sentence that piles up rebellion, Vicksburg, Gettysburg, in one big disjointed stack. 4.5 months later, however, these words will get sorted out and become the memorable 7 years ago. And the ungainly allusion to rebellion and to battle will become a swift, logical progression from a great civil war to a great battlefield of that war. 7 years ago is thus a stretch from vernacular speech toward middle-class refinement. But notice that Lincoln does not stretch it all the way to becoming classical speech, full of Demosthenes and Thermopylae. The model from which Lincoln developed the improved vocabulary of 7 years comes not from classical Athens or classical Rome, but from a contemporary political speech, a highly touted thank you given in July 1861 by a Pennsylvania congressman, Gulezo Guelzo, after his election as Speaker of the House of Representatives. On that occasion in 1861, Guelzo said this: 80 years ago, 56 bold merchants, farmers, lawyers, and mechanics, the representatives of a few feeble colonists scattered along the Atlantic seaboard, met in convention to found a new empire based on the inalienable rights of man. There's no way of telling what it was about Guelzo's speech that stuck in Lincoln's mind for 2 years, but it definitely cancels out any notion that Lincoln was reaching for a classical, collegiate style. If anything, the unprecedented popularity which attached itself at once to the Gettysburg Address actually marks the end of the dominance and prestige of classical Latinate speech in American rhetoric, and its sad consignment to oddity. The Gettysburg Address marks, as one historian has written, the end of the culture of eloquence, burying it alongside the soldiers in the National Cemetery, and raising instead in its place the standard of middling speech. Still, anyone with ears to hear in 1863 would have heard more than Gulezo Guelzo in that opening 7 years. Those 4 words would have been instantly recognizable as a rhetorical shadow of the meditation on the brevity of human life. The days of our years are 80 years and 10, in Psalm 90, verse 10, in the Authorized Version of the Bible. In fact, beyond that, the new nation, which the founders brought forth upon this continent, is likewise a rhetorical shadow of Luke chapter 2, verse 7, where the Virgin Mary brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger. But certainly the most obvious biblical allusion was the one reserved for the end of the address, that dedication to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, which will result in a new birth of freedom. The new birth being an echo of the 3rd chapter of St. John's Gospel. Except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. These echoes of the Authorized Version of the Bible may suggest to our biblically illiterate sensibilities something more ornate and recondite than middling speech. But in fact, the Authorized Version of the Bible was very much the property of middling speakers. Lincoln had it ground to familiarity in his childhood, and it provided an easy rhetorical connection to a population which still understood and embraced the Authorized Version as tantamount to God's own speech. In fact, the Authorized Version was, for all of its Elizabethan and Jacobean origins, clung to determinedly by middle-class Protestants for another century. So the Gettysburg Address was not an effort by Lincoln to confine himself to a collection of monosyllabic grunts. He was showing how a great idea could be captured without resorting to the stilted formality of classical speech. And in that respect, it was really one slice of a larger culture war being waged in the Civil War by a free labor middle class against, on the one hand, an elite culture of slaveholders and their allies who despised middle-class values, and a vernacular culture whose envy of the middle class had led them into an unholy alliance with the planters. Those who may be reluctant to follow this analysis of Lincoln's middling speech may want to chalk up the fame of the address to a more humdrum quality, and that is its compactness. It is short, and therefore it's easy to remember and to memorize. It was, to be sure, intended to be short, since Lincoln had not been invited to deliver an oration, but, in the words of the invitation issued by the local Gettysburg promoter, David Wills, to formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use by a few appropriate remarks. And one has to wonder if the stress in Wills's invitation was on few. As Lincoln told the journalist Noah Brooks, "My speech isn't long, it is short, short, short." There would be a formal oration, but it would be delivered not by Lincoln, but by the formidable Massachusetts orator Edward Everett, former Massachusetts congressman and governor, U.S. senator, briefly, member of President Millard Fillmore's cabinet, president of Harvard, and most recently, and most ironically, candidate for vice president in 1860 on the short-lived Constitutional Union Party ticket, running against Lincoln. And along with Edward Everett, there would be a lengthy prayer from the congressional chaplain, Thomas Stockton, an ode composed by Benjamin French, and a benediction pronounced by the president of nearby Pennsylvania College, Henry L. Bauger, whose son lay buried in the nearby town cemetery, mortally wounded at Shiloh the year before. Everett, as the principal draw of the November 19th ceremonies, delivered a 2.5-hour, 13,000-word doozy of an address. It was, in its own way, a perfectly respectable example of classical rhetorical art, coming from the occupant of Harvard's Eliot Chair in Greek literature, and much, much more classical than Lincoln's. Everett began by reminding the thousands who crowded into the new cemetery that it was appointed by law in Athens that the obsequies of the citizens who fell in battle should be performed at the public expense and in the most honorable manner. And from there he proceeded to invoke those who fell at Marathon and Horace's maxim that it is sweet and becoming to die for one's country. And along with Horace, he invokes Romulus, Cyrus, and Caesar, and concludes with a quotation from Thucydides. "The whole earth," said Pericles as he stood over the remains of his fellow citizens who had fallen in the first year of the Peloponnesian War, "the whole earth is the sepulchre of illustrious men." The problem was that it was all length and no soundbite. And at the end, there was little alternative to memorizing the whole thing or simply forgetting it. Lincoln's long suit, however, was his capacity to capture an idea in the fewest and clearest words possible. Lincoln was certainly capable of going as long a distance as anyone else in mid-19th century America when it came to speaking. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are evidence of that. But John Todd Stewart, who had been his first mentor in reading law and who knew Lincoln for over 30 years, thought that Lincoln was, simply by temperament, logical, mathematical. He had nothing rhetorical in his nature. Lincoln had, after all, been a trial lawyer in a state where juries were still pulled into the jury box from bystanders in the back of the courtroom. And he would either make his point clearly and swiftly, or he would not be practicing law for very long. He did not rate professional orators like Everett very highly. And to Noah Brooks, Lincoln singled out Everett as a particularly grinding example of classical sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, do you know, I think Edward Everett was very much overrated, Lincoln said. There was one speech in which, addressing a statue of John Adams and a picture of Washington in Faneuil Hall, Boston, he apostrophized them and said, "Teach us the love of liberty protected by law." That, Lincoln admitted, was very fine, but it was only a good idea, introduced by noble language. Looked at from that angle, Abraham Lincoln is a man of no verbal wastage. In the Gettysburg Address, he describes the past and what it did, which was to create a republic of equal citizens, then describes what the people at the ceremonies are doing in the present, which is dedicating a cemetery, and then moves to what they are to do for the future, which is to dedicate themselves to the same principles the soldiers were dedicated to. In that way, the address is almost anorexic. It makes no mention of slavery, no mention of the Constitution, no mention of democracy, paints no great picture of the great battle, even fails to acknowledge the civilian politicians, David Wills of Gettysburg, Andrew Curtin, the governor of Pennsylvania, who had made the purchase of the cemetery possible. And yet, for all of its compactness, the Gettysburg Address is not quite so compact as it seems. It may be only 272 words long, but those 272 words are strung out into 10 complicated sentences, all of which are much more cumbersome to parse and diagram on a blackboard than they are to hear in the open. And Lincoln does not mind throwing compactness to the wind when he wants to make a lilting impression on the ear. The well-known repetitive triplets, "We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground," and "government of the people, by the people, for the people." Those are actually the opposite of compactness. Now, they actually constitute a puzzling luxury if we consider the address only as a terse alternative to Edward Everett, inclining to still more terseness. But Lincoln was not offering a treatise to be read. He was offering an exhortation to be heard. Like middling speech, the address is an effort to persuade rather than to ornament or to decorate or to narrate. And each stroke of those triplets is a powerful pull on the convictions of Lincoln's listeners, hauling them upwards toward climaxes that overcome the attentive mind with emotion, even as they persuade it with logic. So if not shortness or compactness, what does account for the fame of the address? For that, we must hear the Gettysburg Address as Lincoln's hearers heard it, and see that the real impact of the address arose from the single aspect of the address that we are the least likely to recognize at once. And that was the survival of democracy. We take democracy for granted as the default position of human societies, as the natural template for modern politics, as the end of history. And so it's difficult for us to be moved by an address which, at bottom, is a series of reasons why democracy should not be abandoned. Like Thomas Jefferson in 1826, we today are confident that the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred ready to ride them. But in truth, even as Jefferson wrote those words, the confidence of the founders that the disorders, oppressions, and incertitude of Europe will terminate very much in favor of the rights of man was evaporating. The French Revolution, which promised to be the American Revolution's beachhead in Europe, swiftly circled downwards into the reign of terror, and then the tyranny of Bonaparte. Democratic uprisings in Spain in 1820, in Russia in 1825, in France in 1830, and across Europe in 1848 were crushed or subverted by newly renascent monarchies and romantic philosophers, glorying in regimes built upon blood and soil and nationality rather than the rights of man. At every point, democracy, government by the consent of the governed, lay discredited and disgraced. And a cynical Prussian nobleman, Otto von Bismarck, could advise his French counterpart that, although he said that in early life his tendencies were all toward republicanism, he had discovered that when you have governed men for several years, you, a liberal, will be transformed from a republican into a monarchist. Believe me, one cannot lead or bring to prosperity a great nation without the principle of authority, that is, the monarchy. The outbreak of the American Civil War only gave the monarchs further reason to rejoice, because the success of the American democracy was the one thing which unsettled their captive peoples, and threw their theories about the superiority of autocracy into the shade. That this same troublesome democracy would, in 1861, obligingly proceed to blow its own political brains out, and do it in defense of the virtues of human slavery, gave the monarchs of Europe no end of delight. The success of the slaveholding secessionists in America would breathe to the King of the Belgians, Leopold I, with a sigh of relief, raise a barrier against the United States and provide a support for the monarchical aristocratic principle in the southern states. The Union is in agony, wrote the Spanish minister from Washington to his queen, and our mission is not to delay its death for a moment. Lincoln also saw the fundamental issue of the Civil War as the question of democracy's death, only from precisely the opposite perspective from that of Bismarck and Leopold. This nation, Lincoln said, had been dedicated to the democratic proposition that all men are created equal. The Civil War was the test of whether democratic regimes, whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. The United States had survived two severe tests of such a government. Lincoln listed them: the successful establishing and the successful administering of it. But there remained, Lincoln said, one final test for the American Republic to pass: its successful maintenance against a formidable internal attempt to overthrow it. And that test was now upon them in the form of the Civil War. The central idea pervading this struggle, Lincoln told his secretary, John Hay, back at the beginning of the war, is the necessity of proving that popular government, government of the people, is not an absurdity. For if we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of people to govern themselves. If democracies are too unstable to prevent their own self-disintegration, and too feckless to stop self-disintegration when it starts, then the folly and instability of democracy would lie open and exposed for all time. And the collapse of what Lincoln called the last best hope of earth would be considered as proof positive of the need for a Bismarck or a Leopold to run the show. The Battle of Gettysburg, with its astounding and seemingly bottomless list of dead and maimed, offered Lincoln the first substantial glimmer during the war that the test would indeed be passed. Gettysburg was not only a victory, but a victory won with the Union armies back to the wall, and its news came with symbolic appropriateness on the anniversary of American independence. Above all, the victory was itself the product of enormous self-sacrifice. 3,903 Union dead, 18,735 wounded, 5,425 missing. A third again more than all the British and Allied casualties at Waterloo. And these casualties were not professional soldiers, the Duke of Wellington's scum of the earth, who had taken their shilling and their chance together. Nor were they dispirited peasants driven into battle by the whips of their betters. They were precisely those ordinary middle-class citizens whom democracy's cultured despisers had laughingly doubted could ever be made to do anything but calculate profits and losses. These people, these middle-class bourgeoisie, with their middle-class manners, middle-class tastes, and middle-class speech, these people whom the German poet Heinrich Heine dismissed in 1834 as boors, living in that big pig pen of freedom. These people whom another German poet, Niklaus Lenau, raged at as appallingly dull and possessed of a strange, cold mirth. These people whom Charles Dickens sneered at as the ebb of honest men's contempt. These had risen up and offered everything they had, present and future, that that nation might live. Looking out over the semicircular rows of graves in the Gettysburg Cemetery, Lincoln saw in them a transcendence that few people, then or now, have been willing to concede to democracy. And in that transcendence, he saw something that all Americans could borrow, a renewed dedication to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, to self-government of the people, by the people, for the people. The genius of the address thus lay not in its language or its brevity, virtues though these were, but in its triumphant repudiation of the criticisms of democracy, and in the new birth it gave to those who had become discouraged and wearied by democracy's follies. It is worth remembering how central a position the address gives to those who fought here, because there is a fourth reason for the high esteem in which we hold the Gettysburg Address, and that is that the Union won the Civil War. The Gettysburg Address is a remarkably optimistic document, and not surprisingly, because much of its optimism was drawn from the euphoria following the battle and the fall of Vicksburg, which together gave Lincoln and the Union the happiest season they had enjoyed in the war since the early spring of 1862. The successes of the summer of 1863 continued, too, as Port Hudson surrendered after Vicksburg and opened the Mississippi to almost complete control by Union forces, followed by the nearly bloodless capture of the rebel railroad at Chattanooga. And then there were political victories as well. Against every prediction that summer, anti-war Copperhead candidates for governor in Ohio and Pennsylvania were resoundingly defeated in the fall elections. "The signs look better," Lincoln said in September. "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea. Peace does not appear so distant as it did." And with that would come proof, he felt, that democracies are not doomed to self-destruction, and that among free men there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet. But that optimism turned out to be cruelly premature. There was much bloody work ahead in 1864 and 1865. And if it had not gone well, if Grant had not taken Richmond, or Sherman not taken Atlanta, or Farragut not closed off Mobile Bay, and especially if Lincoln had not been reelected, then the war would have turned to a very different conclusion. With an independent Southern Confederacy hugging the Gulf and the South Atlantic coastlines, strangling the Mississippi River Valley and spreading its imperialistic pro-slavery tentacles into the Caribbean and Central America, while the Northern Union shrank into a Scandinavian irrelevance. In such a case, the Gettysburg Address would not and could not have been hailed as acknowledging some great and stirring truth, but would instead stand as a piece of political huff and puff on behalf of a sinking cause. We see greatness in the address only because untold numbers of soldiers died in the next 20 months to ensure that we could see the war as a success. Without that vindication in arms, the Gettysburg Address would have become little noted and not very long remembered. And the multitudes buried in the Soldiers' National Cemetery over yonder would literally have died in vain. And all of that middling terseness and meaning built into the address would have counted for nothing. The Gettysburg Address is, when reduced to its minimum, only the remarks of an American president spoken at the dedication of a national cemetery. Unlike the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address cannot be taken into a court of law to prove anything. And it certainly did not, as the proclamation did, set 3 million slaves legally and forever free. On that scale, it can sometimes seem that the address is simply an example of something being well known for being well known. And it may be to avoid the phenomenon of empty celebrity that we fix on its vocabulary or its compactness as explanations for its high and enduring standing. But it really is the meaning of the address which struck observers in 1863. The problem is that this has become dimmed in our celebrations of the address, partly due to its success. We see the Civil War today as an issue in racial justice or as a critical moment in constitutional history, which is what leads us to wonder why slavery in the Constitution did not appear in the address. But the truth is that the Gettysburg Address speaks to an issue which flew far above slavery or jurisprudence. The issue on which the resolution of our racial injustices and constitutional shortcomings all actually depended on the survival of democracy itself. For what we intended to do about race or slavery or the Constitution would never come to pass at all, as Bismarck hoped, if democracy itself went down for the 10 count in 1863. Lincoln was not under any illusions that he could save democracy merely by his own rhetorical power. He was more right than we think when he said that the world would little note nor long remember what we say here. Because all that was said that November day, by himself and by Everett, by Thomas Stockton, the congressional chaplain, and by Henry Balger, the college president, and by Benjamin French, the third-rate poet, all of what was said rested entirely on never forgetting what they did here. It was from them, not from his words, that Lincoln knew that the new birth of freedom would emerge. Perhaps in the end, the greatness we have not suspected in the address lies in its humility. Its reminder that the question of democracy's survival does ultimately rest in the hands, not of czars, but in the hands of those citizens who see in democracy something worth dying for, something that kings or slave masters or bureaucrats or Georgetown cocktail parties could never understand. What we needed and got so memorably from Lincoln was precisely that reminder. We could use it again today. Thank you very much.